Well, your parents and grandparents aren't going to be too happy about this, but their worst nightmares are coming to fruition. Both atheism and socialism are on the rise around the globe simultaneously. And while they're not mutually exclusive, obviously, I do think that their growth is fueled by the same factors, at least in part. So today, I'm going to take some time to explain to older generations why people in my generation and younger are all godless socialist heathens. Now, generally speaking, socialism has far more support now than it ever did. But having said that, it's still not that much support overall. As Newsweek points out, an NBC News poll found that just 18% of Americans view socialism positively compared to 49% who view it negatively. Socialism fared much better in a poll from Gallup, with 39% viewing it positively. A November poll from The Economist and YouGov got the same result as the aforementioned NBC News poll, with 18% favoring socialism. But here's where it really gets interesting. Jacobin shared the result from a YouGov Cato poll, which shows that favorability towards socialism among 18 to 29-year-olds is at 62%, which is an 11-point jump since 2019, which is a lot. Now, these numbers tell us a lot of things. First and foremost, they tell us that socialism has been completely destigmatized among younger populations. They simply don't hold the same views as their parents and grandparents who grew up during the McCarthy and Cold War era. They view it as a logical alternative to capitalism, which has completely failed them, which is why so many young people are voting for candidates who self-identify as democratic socialists, like Bernie, AOC, and Zoran. But older generations, they still don't like socialism primarily because they associate it with authoritarianism, and they view capitalism more positively because, quite frankly, they reap the rewards of capitalism. They were able to buy homes and put themselves through school and subsist off of a single income, and because of that, they're always going to be nostalgic for the system that propelled them into the middle class. This isn't true for all older generations. Not every single boomer is living it up right now, but most of the generation, they benefited more from the social safety net that came about during the FDR era. My generation, however, they just didn't have that same experience with capitalism. I mean, for millennials, we graduated into the Great Recession. We were told that if we worked really hard and went to college, we'd land ourselves good paying, decent jobs. But all that got us was debt that we cannot escape from. We literally cannot file bankruptcy on our student loans. And my generation just doesn't have wealth like older generations. Like, we can't buy homes, we can't buy cars, we don't go on vacations and travel. Oftentimes, young people have to have second jobs or side hustles just to make ends meet. And for all of those reasons, we associate capitalism with misery and greed and exploitation because that's been the totality of our experience with this godforsaken system, whereas older generations and the ruling class associate capitalism with growth and freedom because they experienced capitalism in its earlier stages where wealth wasn't concentrated entirely like at the top with just a handful of people. And this is a global phenomenon too, by the way. It's not just unique to the United States, but the generational divide was on full display in this exchange between a British news anchor and Fiona Lawley of the British Communist Party, and I want to play it for you because it really shows you everything wrong with the mentality of older generations who don't understand why young people could possibly gravitate towards socialism.
Is it that young people have had too many handouts, they've had it easy? Technology has made life easy for us, and maybe now they're being attracted to socialism, whereas perhaps capitalism is what got them the good life, as Charlie describes it.
Yeah. To be honest, I almost don't even feel the need to make an argument based on what Charlie just said, because I think it really represents just how out of touch the ruling class and much of the establishment and millionaires are with young people today, and not only their lives, but also the mood that exists amongst young people. I mean, this is the first generation that is going to be worse off than their parents. Young people are saddled with debt by the time they get into their mid-20s. The thought of buying a house is a far-off dream for so many people. Lots of young people are putting off and not even considering having kids because of the cost of living crisis. I mean, it's just extraordinary to suggest that young people are looking towards socialism just because they're living a life of luxury. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the fact that capitalism has produced so much inequality in their own lives here in the West, but also around the world through war and genocide and imperialism, that's making young people think this system is sick and I want an alternative. And so many of them are looking to socialism, and even beyond socialism, they're looking to communism and communist ideas because they want something fundamentally different than what capitalism has to offer them, because it's offering them nothing and definitely not a future.
And she is absolutely correct. Nobody is becoming a socialist because they think it's cool and they want to hop on some bandwagon. The rise of socialism is a direct result of the failure of capitalism. If my generation grew up in the same sort of economic environment as older generations, I guarantee you socialism would not be as popular as it is today, because nobody's going to look for alternatives to a status quo that benefits them. It's when the status quo isn't working, it's when things are bad, that they begin to look for alternatives. And let me just say that if you're distraught about the fact that your son or daughter is becoming a socialist, well, it's good that they're opting for socialism, because it could be worse. Because that same desperation that makes people yearn for alternatives like socialism is also what's fueling the rise of global fascism. So in a late-stage capitalist system, neoliberalism and incrementalism simply isn't going to cut it. People want extreme changes to the system that has failed them. It's why so-called moderates in both parties have failed to stave off the rise of fascism and socialism. Not that they're comparable, but when your options are limited, you can't ever get out of poverty, you have nowhere to go, you want to blow up the system. And socialism is the best way to do that, because as we're now learning with Donald Trump, fascism simply reinforces the capitalist status quo, albeit through violence, whereas socialism is something completely different. Socialism is where workers own the means of production so that way they can enjoy the fruits of their labor. Socialism is when wealth is distributed equitably, so that way a handful of rich pricks don't have it all while the rest of us are left with crumbs. So to put it simply, the rise of socialism is a direct response to the collapse of capitalism, and it's shocking that they don't understand this. More importantly, socialism is the only viable alternative to fascism. Late-stage capitalism always devolves into fascism, and for that reason, liberal parties that fail to adapt and embrace socialism are complicit with the rise of fascism themselves. But that brings us to atheism, which is also on the rise as a response to the collapse of religion. In fact, atheism is growing faster than every other religion, and as the Dallas Express reports, a Gallup survey published in July covering nearly 43,000 respondents across 42 countries from 2005 to 2024 documented a clear upward trajectory of people who consider themselves atheists. Their proportion of self-described convinced atheists rose from 6% in 2005 to 10% in 2024. Over the same period, the percentage of people describing themselves as religious fell from 68% to 56%, while those identifying as not religious increased from 21% to 28%. A separate Pew Research Center report released in June examined religious switching patterns between 2010 and 2020 and found that the population of the religiously unaffiliated grew by 17% from 1.6 billion to 1.9 billion people. That lifted their global representation from 23% to 24%, the largest net gain of any major religious group during the decade, outpacing even Islam's growth of 357 million followers. Pew noted sharp increases in Europe, North America, and parts of Latin America. By 2020, those who considered themselves unaffiliated to any religion had become the majority in 10 countries or territories, up from 7 a decade earlier. Now, generally speaking, this trend is more pronounced in higher income countries because as economies grow and societies liberalize, reliance on religion overall tends to go down because people begin to shift from a pre-material to a post-material political orientation. So what that means is once your country develops to a point where you're no longer worrying about basic necessities like, food, shelter, water, security, at that point, you tend to adapt a more post-material view of the world, where you want democracy and civil rights and civil liberties, which makes sense because basic survival is always going to trump one's desire for freedom and liberty. It explains why so many Americans opted for Donald Trump, even though they knew that he was a threat to democracy. At least I hope they knew that he was a threat to democracy. But they didn't care that he was a threat to democracy so long as he helped them put food on the table. I'm not sure why they thought he would help them with that, but that's what they thought. And time after time, people have shown that they're willing to sacrifice freedom for stability because when push comes to shove, basic survival is always going to come first at the end of the day. And when you address people's material needs, that is how you move them back to a post-materialist worldview where they care about civil rights and democracy and freedom again. Now, religion tends to wane in the same way because a lot of people use religion as a crutch that's there when they need it. And I'm not saying that to be insulting to people who are religious, but that's how it's used in a lot of ways. So if they're doing better economically speaking, they're less likely to lean on that crutch. And the less that they use it, the less dependent they become on it, which leads to them moving away from religion altogether oftentimes. I mean, sure, they might run back to their religion if a loved one dies or is sick or if they experience a medical emergency. You know, there's no atheists in foxholes, as the saying goes, right? But the less habitual it becomes, the more likely it is that that person will end up abandoning their religiosity in general. They lose that muscle memory, so to speak, if that makes sense, which then opens the door to them questioning their faith altogether and possibly becoming atheist or agnostic. So globally, the rise in atheism can be attributed to underdeveloped countries starting to develop to a certain point. But I think that this trend is starting to speed up because of the rise of socialism and simultaneous fall of capitalism. And that's because religion, like all things, eventually becomes commodified in capitalist societies. In the United States, you see megachurches on the rise to the point where they form these networks and try to become monopolies and focus on profit maximization as opposed to faith and helping out their communities. We are in this era right now where you see religion be a complete, money-making scheme, and not necessarily smaller churches per se, but where you see these mega churches where they have televangelists and these prosperity preachers. And, if you're a true believer, you can't not see that as a contradiction, right? You can't not feel like your religion is being hijacked because wealth maximization is antithetical to Jesus' message. But if it becomes common, it could broadly delegitimize organized religion, which could result in a decrease in church attendance in favor of a more personalized version of Christianity, which is then, going to get you out of the habit and lead you to the path of atheism, possibly. Maybe you don't think about religion for a while, and then you just kind of dismiss it altogether. It's hard to say where people go. And just in the United States context, the rise of atheism, much like the rise in socialism, is in part due to backlash because the dominant religion in America, which is Christianity, has been hijacked by a fascist political movement. As Leslie Abravanel put it for Alternet, they've co-opted Jesus and turned it into an absurd farce, which is a concise summary of the conclusion from Bill McKibben's lengthy write-up about the modern Christian movement in The Guardian. Now, I would highly recommend that you read this article because he explains how the dominant strain of Christianity is fundamentally at odds with the Christianity that he grew up with in every conceivable way, seeing as how it's attached itself to a toxic personality cult of a perverted president who posts AI-generated videos of himself shitting on people. I mean, it's why some evangelicals are quietly moving away from the MAGA movement because they're now realizing that the politicization of their faith is actually causing people to leave the faith in droves, which is bad for business because less congregates means less tithes. But if they draw a hard line between them and MAGA, they could piss off MAGA loyalists. So they've kind of boxed themselves into a corner, and needless to say, the Christian leaders who chose to get in bed with the Republican Party decades ago are now reaping what they've sown. Because even though it's made them a dominant force in politics for generations, they inadvertently initiated the beginning of the end of their entire religion, at least in the United States. And in the same way that neoliberals haven't been able to adapt to the changing economic climate, evangelicals haven't been able to adapt to the changing social climate. I say this because atheism is particularly pronounced among LGBTQ plus people. I mean, ask yourself why that is. Quite frankly, it's because there's no hate like Christian love. As somebody who was raised as a fundamentalist evangelical, I can't tell you how traumatic it is for the church to teach you that you're inherently flawed for being gay when you're very young. At the age you're starting to realize that you might be gay yourself. It fucks with your head. You develop an internalized hatred for yourself, which leads to a plethora of psychological issues or exacerbates existing ones like it did for me. And it creates an existential fear of rejection from your family who've also been taught that being gay is a sin. And The church thought that they could flex their newfangled political muscle to suppress LGBTQ plus rights, but they just couldn't stop the tide of social change, and their bigotry has officially blown up in their faces because it's not just queer people who resent the church for their homophobia and transphobia. It's the friends and family members of queer people who resent the church for teaching society to look down on people that they love, and their antiquated views on abortion, on contraception, and trans people, and even immigrants has led to a mass exodus from the church, which they're just not handling well, right? And since Christians in America have lost credibility and they can't really win people over by just making their religion seem more appealing, they've opted to adopt a more nationalist stance and try to force their religion on the rest of society. But they don't understand that the more they push, the more hated they'll become, the more atheists they will inadvertently make. And while most queer people and their allies, abandon the church, not all of them abandon religion altogether. Like others who've moved away from organized religion, maybe they just focus on their personal relationship with Jesus. But the problem is that once you feel turned off by your church and you already have one foot out the door and your mind is open, you begin to question whether or not the whole thing is a farce. If everything else that they taught you, was so wrong, if they're wrong about gay rights, are they wrong about just God in general? Like, it's a slippery slope for these people, for lack of a better word. But, it's not just backlash to the church that's fueling atheism, in my opinion. I think that the rise of socialism is also fueling the rise of atheism as well, because it goes back to religion being an opiate for the masses, as Marx put it, because we're taught that we should accept the status quo because even though we're impoverished on earth, we're going to have vast riches in heaven. So if that's the case, what's the point of rising up and overthrowing the status quo when all we have to do is wait? And one day in the afterlife, we'll be as rich as the billionaires are here on Earth. And I'm sorry, but that's just not a very compelling solution because it basically forces you to accept that you're going to be miserable and you should just suck it up and deal with it because you're going to have a pleasant afterlife. But socialism is at odds with that philosophy because it fosters a kind of self-worth in ourselves that was taken from us by capitalism and Christianity. And it teaches us that we do deserve to benefit from the fruits of our labor here on Earth because every life is valuable, not just the lives of the ruling class, and everybody deserves dignity now in this life, and we shouldn't have to wait for it in an afterlife. And ironically, socialism is the quintessential message taught by Jesus. But I think that there's a reason to believe that socialism and atheism are on the rise simultaneously because they're compatible. They go together like peanut butter and jelly because atheists believe that there is no afterlife. So this is all you're going to get. So make the best of it. And socialism tells you how to make the best of it and gives you something to work towards. It's kind of a paradigm shift because our parents were taught that you should have faith in God and trust in the system, whereas younger generations are rejecting those ideologies that reinforce the status quo. So it's a new way of thinking. And that, in a nutshell, is why both socialism and atheism are on the rise, at least in my humble opinion. And I think that might scare some of you, especially if you're an older person who grew up during the Cold War and still associates socialism with authoritarianism. But even if you disagree with the direction that young people plan to take the world in, it is important to try to understand why young people feel the way that they do, because this is all happening for a reason. And rather than lashing out and attacking them and calling them stupid, you should understand that their move towards socialism and atheism is motivated by reason and logic.
The Humanist Report is fake news. Mike only cares about Crazy Bernie and his wacky socialist ideas. Sad, very sad. I'm unsubscribing.